So, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar with Charles Plant, Axel Vandenberg, and Hicham Raik, who will discuss today the Quebec strategy to combat poverty and how successful the province has been in that initiative. My name is Sarah Fortin, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Coordinator for the Canadian Research Data Center Network. And I'm pleased to have you today. And before I introduce our speakers, I will just take a few minutes to present briefly the network for those of you who may not be familiar with this organization yet. So the CRDCN is a partnership between Statistics Canada and over 30 Canadian universities, and we are supported by SHRC, CIHR, and the CFI. As the map shows here, it is truly a pan-Canadian network and comprising 30 facilities today across the country, and it's also recognized since last year as a major scientific infrastructure by the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. So as many of you know, research data centers are secure computer labs where researchers with an approved project can access a Statistics Canada confidential microdata, including longitudinal surveys, census data, and increasingly a number of administrative data sets as well. Last year, more than 1,500 researchers from various disciplines have accessed one of the RDC across the country, and about a third of these were graduate students, as today is an example, actually. We have a student among us as a presenter. Alors, the research carried through the network is very diverse, as you can imagine, and they have helped to better understand socioeconomic developments affecting the whole society, as well as factors affecting individual life course and life and well-being. Among other topics, we can mention population aging, economic integration of immigrants, socioeconomic determinants of health, income inequality, of course, labor market participation, and child development. If you want to know more about us, I invite you to visit our website. The address is shown at the top here, so it's easy to find more about us, including publication and the data set available in the network. Next slide, please. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today. So we first have Professor Axel Vandenberg, who is a full professor in the Department of Sociology at McGill University. Charles Plant is a PhD candidate at, in the same department at McGill as well, and he's currently a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Saskatchewan. And finally, hi Chuck, Hicham Raik is a researcher and a lecturer at the University of Montreal. He's also a graduate from McGill, if I'm not wrong. So they are three of the co-authors of the book recently released by the University of Toronto Press last fall, actually. So, Combating Poverty, Quebec's Pursuit of a Distinctive Welfare State. And Christine Prou and Sam Fossman were part of the team. And they have now both had their PhD at McGill. So if you want to know more, you can buy the book. Actually, I must say we've prepared a research highlight. We will post it on the website, so it's a shorter kind of page document summarizing their findings. All right, thank you. Next slide, indeed. So, if you want to ask a question, first of all we ask you. We will take your question at the end of the presentation, and we ask you that you write them down. So you have to open a control panel, as shown here, and then you will see the question tab where you can write your question, and we'll read them to the presenter when the time comes. Next slide, please. Yes, so just in concluding, I wanted to mention that the webinar will be recorded. The PowerPoint will be available after the presentation on our YouTube channel. And if you didn't know, there's currently a call for proposal for our annual conference, which will take place in Hamilton this year, next October. So I invite you to submit your proposal if you have not done yet. So thank you, gentlemen, for accepting our invitation and for sharing your research with us. The mic is now over to you, Axel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I want to thank, first of all, the network, the RDC network, for having us allowing us to present this book. It's also a very appropriate venue for us to present this book, because this book really came out of a project, and I'm going to preface the rest of the presentation with a little bit now. It came out of a project that I started together with Paul Bernard of the Université de Montréal. And Paul Bernard was one of the architects of the network. I mean, it was absolutely crucial in creating the network, together with Statistics Canada and all the universities that have been involved in its creation. So this is really an homage to Paul Bernard. Unfortunately, he died in February 2011, while we were just a year and a half into this project. So the project originally started, we started talking to each other about this in 2008-9. And the issue was, how different is Quebec really becoming from the rest of Canada in terms of social policy? You see it on this slide, it's called Quebec's virage sociodémocratique. At the time, and this continues to be the case, and had been the case at least since the 1970s, 80s with the rise of the PQ, there was a lot of talk in Quebec about social democracy, and how Quebec had a social or at least the PQ had a social democratic wing and tradition, and how Quebec was seeking to imitate, or to follow, I should say, the Scandinavian countries in their social democratic policies. And certainly it is the case that Quebec was becoming more and more distinct over, especially since the mid-1990s roughly, with the introduction of the famous subsidized daycare system. Those were followed after a series of social summits that were organized by Lucien Bouchard's government in 1996, by a series of reforms supporting families and emphasizing activating programs to get people back into the labor force. And then there is the famous Bill 112, the Act to Combat Poverty and Social Exclusion, which was adopted in 2002 by a unanimous vote in the National Assembly in Quebec City, and which promised a very ambitious program to fight poverty, which was slowly but surely implemented with major new money as of 2004-05. And then finally there's the enriched parental care leave program that Quebec introduced in 2006, in addition to the federal program under the employment insurance system. So there clearly are major differences between Quebec and the other provinces in this respect. And I think maybe we should go to the next slide. What we've done is we have looked at, first and foremost, at all the policies that we could find in government budgets, government publications, and the literature in the four major provinces of Canada, to see whether Quebec actually stood out. And the two things that we wanted to know most about was whether all the talk about activation in following the Scandinavian model was justified in the Quebec case, and whether or not they had in fact followed the family-oriented anti-poverty policies that they also thought belonged to the Scandinavian social investment style approach to welfare, with a view of breaking the intergenerational poverty cycle. And so what we did is we looked at every policy that we could possibly find over the period from 2002 to 2012, which is the date for which we had the most recent poverty outcome figures available. And this was an extremely painstaking and sometimes extraordinarily mind-numbing exercise. But we added up every policy and every permutation of a policy because it turns out that the politicians constantly renamed their policies, but the policies often stayed the same over this period of time, and calculated what percentage of the GDP Quebec was spending on these policies compared to the other provinces. We found, first of all, that Quebec certainly had a much broader array with more scope of policies than did the other provinces with respect to employment, with respect to activation, with respect to child benefits, for instance, and housing subsidies and so on. But they also spent a lot more. And as you can see here, we have subdivided the policies between family-oriented policies and others. We had several categorizations because we were interested in activation and family, particularly. And you can see that Quebec clearly spends a lot more than the other three major provinces on other policies, which includes everything, all transfers, social assistance, what else is there? Social housing subsidies, activation programs, and family policies, which includes the daycare and includes the parental leave. So clearly Quebec is a bigger spending, and then we looked over time at the different categories of spending that you can see here. Are you going to? Yeah, we are in the next slide, right? So here we have taken only family income support programs. So this excludes the daycare and the parental leave. And you see that nevertheless, as of 2004-05, there is a major jump in Quebec's expenditures compared to the other, certainly compared to the other provinces, but Quebec was already to some extent spending a little bit more than the other provinces. But the difference really becomes spectacular with the introduction of the strategy to combat poverty. Next slide, please. Here we look at activation policies, which include both the daycare and the parental leave policies. These are typically considered activation policies in that they help women with children, and particularly young children, reconcile work and care obligations. And it is an integral part of the so-called Scandinavian approach. And yes, indeed, you see here too that Quebec obviously already spent quite a lot more, because this difference here at the beginning of the period is due primarily to the introduction of the subsidized daycare since 1997. And you see that it goes up here further because primarily the introduction of parental leave. Next slide, please. These are only daycare and parental leave, and you can see the same pattern. Basically, it goes up as of, it's already considerably higher than is the case for the other provinces, but it certainly goes up even further after 2004-05. So in conclusion, in terms of expenditures, it's clear that Quebec stands out with compared to the other three provinces of the rest of Canada. And it stands out specifically in the ways in which policymakers have been claiming it would stand out. That is, in terms of activation policies and in terms of focusing on its social and employment policies on families with children. So now the question becomes, has it had the effects that were anticipated in the in Bill 112, where it states that Quebec wants to become one of the societies with the lowest levels of poverty of any of the advanced OECD countries. So Chuck, go ahead.
Thanks, Axel. I'm gonna turn my screen on. Yeah, so the main outcome variable that we were interested in for this was poverty outcomes. And so it's probably the best place to start is with how we measured that. In Canada, there's several leading measures of that are used for examining poverty throughout the country. And we used the one that is most popular in Quebec and the one that was actually identified by the Centre d'études sur la pauvreté et exclusion, which is an agency that was set up in Quebec to evaluate their poverty reduction efforts, which is a little different from the the main three that we know that we generally recognize. So really quick, those three are the low income cutoff, or LICO, which we didn't want to use because it hasn't really been updated since 1992, and I think has generally fallen out of use, at least among researchers. Second, we have the market basket measure, which is more promising, but it can't be used to explore historical trends since it only goes back to about 2000, and it also can't be used to make international comparisons. And given Quebec's objective of realizing low poverty, not necessarily relative to other provinces in Canada, but to other countries in the world, it was important to us to be able to make comparisons internationally. The low income measure does work for international comparisons, but primarily at the national level. Things kind of break down when you try to use it to compare provinces. Costs of living are quite different throughout the country from province to province. And so it was for that reason that the CEP identified the measure that we ended up using as the best measure for comparing the province, which is basically the low income measure, but based at the provincial level rather than the federal level. And just a quick reminder, the low income measure is 50% of provincial median size adjusted household income. We also at places will mention an acute poverty rate. This is the 30% threshold rather than the 50%, and this gives us a sense of the poverty rate among the most poor, I guess. So it's analogous to considering the gap ratio, which is an important measure of depth of poverty. So in terms of data that we used, we looked at all the data we could get our hands on at the time that we were writing the book, which was essentially the survey of consumer finances through the survey of labor and income dynamics up to about 2010, and that data series begins in the late 70s in 1976. We also drew on the Luxembourg income study in order for us to make our international comparisons. And we compared Quebec and the other provinces to a handful of select countries. We compared it to lots of countries, but we chose the countries that we focused on in the book in order to represent the different types of welfare regime types that have been identified in the literature. So the United States representing the Anglo-Saxon paradigm and also our neighbors to the south. France and the Netherlands representing the continental paradigm. And then we wanted to have a social democratic regime in each comparison. Because of data limitations, we use Denmark sometimes and Finland and other times. Some of the more established social democratic or archetypical social democratic regimes weren't available for all the variables that we want to look at. And I'll mention that we have run some numbers to sort of update. There's a bit of an epilogue to the presentation, and we might get to it at the end of us talking now, or maybe we'll get to it during questions. But we've sort of filled in the gap since about 2010 with some of our indicators up to about 2015. And for that, we drew on the Canadian Income Survey. I guess I would mention really, just going back one slide, using the 50% provincial median size adjusted, using the provincial limb for our analysis. It's been done for Quebec, within Quebec many times, but it's a bit of an innovation in this project to also use that measure outside of the province of Quebec. And we looked at the 10 largest provinces in Canada in order to make these comparisons. When we look at the provincial limb, so all the poverty rates that we're going to see from now on are provincial limb poverty rates. And so the first couple slides are going to make that explicit, but eventually that naming will drop, that convention will drop. And so I just want to make that clear. So looking at the provincial limb poverty rates for the provinces together and comparing them to the national average, we see that up until at least the early 90s, early to mid 90s, there was quite a bit of similarity in these rates across the 4 large provinces that we look at in this study. But it does look like there's a bit of a spreading out in the late 90s, particularly with the poverty rate in British Columbia sort of taking off. And we do see Quebec emerging toward the bottom of the pack. But especially when we cast that in international, in contrast to the international levels for the countries that we look at, even though Quebec is the lowest in Canada among those 4, we see that Quebec still looks quite a bit more like the Canadian provinces than it does like the other countries that we looked at. So you see the United States at the top. As always, it's got a very high poverty rate among industrialized countries. And then we've got the Netherlands and France that are a little bit lower. with the Netherlands and Denmark sort of being the lowest, with France sort of in between. I find it useful to think about this when I look at this graph, seeing sort of three tranches of poverty rates among industrialized countries. You've got the sort of high poverty countries that have more than 15%, and then we've got the low poverty countries that have less than 10%, and then we've got Canada. The Canadian provinces really squarely in the middle range, with some of the provinces, with the most poor provinces dipping up above 15%, and Quebec just touching on about 10%. So overall, Quebec, low for Canada, but not comparatively all that different. Still more like Canada than it is like the other countries that we looked at, or that we see in other welfare regimes. But these numbers don't take into account other factors, compositional factors that could determine differences in poverty levels between the provinces and as well between the countries. And especially when we consider that a lot of the work that Quebec has done on poverty reduction during this time was really focused on families and working families, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper and take a look at maybe Quebec was being successful in some areas while not in others. And so that's really the bulk of the book, is really digging into these questions. So things that we consider are whether or not these comparative differences hold when we look at different household and family types. We also look at how they change over time within households. So looking at those differences in longitudinal poverty trajectories for different types of families. And then also eventually considering how state generosity and activation combine to mediate these outcomes. And so we're going to kind of work through these. I'll start with the first point, and then Hisham's going to talk about the next 2 points after me. So just to set that up, we introduced a couple of more variables, sets of categories to explore these relationships in greater detail. The first is family type, and the second is labor force attachment or labor force participation. There are more categories than I list here that we considered, but the focus of the book was on families because that's where we found the most findings in this presentation in order to keep it a reasonable length. We've also, I'm going to just sort of touch on the categories that we talk about here. So the first is families. We define families as households with members under 18 and one or two adults in a relationship. Okay, so families with extended members, or households with extended family members in them, are going to be in a residual category. And unattached households are those with just one adult. There's also couples which just have two adults in a relationship. We had defined single earner equivalent as households that worked a combined 27 to 52 weeks, and a dual earner equivalent household as a household that had that worked 53 or more weeks. And those that are identified as not working are households that reported 0 weeks worked. Okay, some of the slides to come. And so you'll recall that when we looked at the provinces in international perspective, when we looked at the overall poverty rates, the provinces clustered together between the different countries, between the Anglo-Saxon regimes and some of the European regimes. What's interesting is that when we zoom in on bi-parent families, this is where we start to really see Quebec take a very different course than the rest of the country, and begin to adopt a trajectory more similar to what we see in the European countries that we looked at. And we can see how that is a development that seems to have emerged since the late 90s, as evidenced by the blue line, the way it sort of drops down toward the gray lines to the right of this graph. This dynamic was similarly pronounced for lone parent families. I should note that even though it looks as though there's a bit of a drop in poverty in the other provinces toward 2010, 2010 for some reason was a bit of an outlier year. And when we look at the years beyond 2010, the provinces go back to their average, their higher average, while Quebec maintains its course in line with the other provinces. I'm sorry, with the other countries, with the European countries. When we look at acute poverty, again, this is very pronounced for bi-parent families. We see acute poverty in Quebec for bi-parent families is practically 0. Just as it is in the Netherlands and Denmark. Meanwhile, for the other Canadian provinces, they're more in line with the US levels. While we actually see that France sort of zigzags all over the place there. Similarly, for lone parent families, we have the same separation, with Quebec clearly a bit of an outlier in Canada, at least among the largest provinces, and having a trajectory much more similar to the most generous European countries. What's really interesting, though, is, as we mentioned earlier, the overall rates don't make, Quebec doesn't look that different from the rest of Canada when we look at the overall rates. And this is because when we go back to the unattached individuals, so these are households that aren't families, that don't have children, Quebec actually has poverty rates that are very consistent with the rest of the country, and actually a bit higher than they tend to be in the United States. So it's one of our findings. And so, yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to Isham to dive a bit deeper into this and these trends, and consider the role of poverty over time and also the labor market aspects of these findings.
Okay, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Sarah, for having us in this conference. Just make sure. So, just to clarify that in our results for the previous chapters were based on cross-sectional data. But for this chapter, we try to focus on the concept of permanent poverty. So we used longitudinal data that follow the same samples during a certain period of time. With this concept, we can see and examine how families can move in and out of poverty during a certain period of time. It's important to look at this dimension of the poverty, because families who stay in poverty for a long time, they will be in complex situations, because they will be more likely to suffer from social exclusion and many other cumulative social problems. And also, the policies needed for this profile of poverty is different from the poverty or what we call the transitional poverty. We examined the poverty between 2002 and 2007. And if you look at this table and the sixth column with 6 years, we can see the percentage of families who has been experiencing poverty for 6 consecutive years. It's like stay in permanently in poverty. And the two main ideas that we can comment in this table is, the first idea is no matter the province of residence, in all the cases, single parents are much more affected by permanent poverty than two parents family in all the provinces. In Ontario particularly, more than 18% of single parents stay in poverty for 6 consecutive years. This is the worst situation if we compare Ontario with other provinces. And we can see that in Quebec, for example, single parents are less likely than Quebec to stay for a long time in poverty. So we can suggest that in Quebec and also in Alberta, poverty is more transitional than permanent if we compare those two provinces with Ontario and BC. Next slide, please. For the following table, we need to clarify some concepts to explain more deeply the different profiles of poverty, and this is the reason that we calculated some others indicator that allows us to more understand the meaning of chronic poverty, or what we call the transitional poverty. we have families who have never been poor during the 6 years. It's the best situation. But we have also families who have an average of income below the poverty line for the entire period examined between 2002 and 2007. And this profile we call this profile of poverty like chronic poverty. And we have also transitory poverty, which refers to families who were poor during at least one of the 6 years, but whose average income remained above the poverty line for the period examined. And like the last table, we have two main comments. The first comment is no matter the province of residence, and in all the cases, single parents are much more affected by chronic and transitory poverty than biparental families. But if we compare provinces for particularly single parents, the chronic poverty is higher in Ontario. If you look at the column of transitory poverty, and it's higher also in BC than Quebec and Alberta. So when we define different profile of poverty, referring to the mentioned concept, transitory and chronic poverty, the objective is to think about the policies needed for each profile. We know, according to our results, that single parents family are at the higher risk to fall into poverty, but they are more likely to experience transitory poverty in Quebec and in Alberta. Instead, in Ontario and BC, they are more likely to experience chronic poverty. In the other hand, chronic poverty is much higher in Ontario and BC among single parents families. And maybe this profile of poverty needs stronger support in terms of social policy, because the chronic poverty, as I mentioned before, is probably associated with many other social problems like health, like long time in employment, etc. Next, please. And now we want to see how and why and how Quebec is different from the other provinces, and how different policies can help families to escape from poverty. And for this, we just wanted to see the difference between policy based on generosity and policies based on activation. In the following graph, we want to see how Quebec is different from the other societies, and we think about the measures in terms of policies, generosity versus activation. If the policies are based in generosity, so the achievement should be the same for working and non-working families. In other words, the policies based on generosity are not related or linked to the fact that individuals are or not in the labor market. And activation policy is like benefits that are closely related to labor force participation. And to see what is the difference between Quebec and other provinces, and to think about the policies or the orientation in terms of policy in Quebec, we decided to compare different type of families according to their attachment to labor markets. And we just in this graph compared Quebec with the other provinces in terms of the labor force participation for women with children under 6 years old. And we can see in this graph that Quebec have the higher level of labor force participation among women with children under 6, and probably we can explain this with the public support in terms of daycare, for example. Next. For the second type of family, we can see for biparent dual earner, so two parents family, the two parents are working full time, and to see the poverty rates for this family if the working families are more likely to escape poverty or not. And we can see for Quebec, for example, for two-parent dual earner families, Quebec presents among the lowest poverty rates in comparison with other provinces and other selected countries. That means working families in Quebec are in a better situation than other provinces. Next. Similar trend for single parent earner when single parents are working. So the fact that they have a job make them in a better situation, and they are more likely to have a better situation and to have very low poverty rates. And we can see that Quebec have almost similar level than countries like France and or Netherlands. Next. But for not working single parents, we can see that in Quebec that we have a higher poverty rate, which can the same facts we can see for the next slide, please. We can see the same thing for in attached not working individuals, and what we can conclude from this is when people are not working in Canada, including Quebec, the poverty rate is very high. In other words, individuals are more likely to escape poverty when they have a job, even for single parents, and it's very important to see that it is the situation also in Quebec, where working single parents are more likely to be in better situation if they are they have a job. But the point is that results suggest, and it's confirmed what Axel said before, that maybe the policy in Quebec are more oriented on activation than generosity, because people, when they are in the labor market, the chance that they escape poverty are very high in comparison with the situation when they are not in the labor market. So this is the message that I want to explain for my slides, and maybe Axel or Charles will continue with the more explanation about policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Isham. So one of the next steps that we took in the book was then to say, okay, well, let's bring all those things back. Let's bring all that together, and let's revisit overall poverty rates, but control for those things. And so what we did in order to do this was estimate what we call standardized poverty rates. Although there's a bit of literature recently by David Brady and American Sociological Review has sort of used a similar technique, where we in effect calculate the poverty rates for the other provinces imagining or simulating that they had the same population composition as Quebec. And so what this allows us to do is compare each province's and country's regime effects net of their population composition. So in other words, if they had achieved the same gains in terms of poverty for the same populations as Quebec, then when we calculated standardized poverty rates, they would have the same poverty rates as Quebec. We did this for internally within Canada and internationally, controlling for first the family composition that we talked about earlier, and then combining the family composition and the labor force attachment. And so this first figure is showing just controlling for the family composition. And one of the first things that starts to emerge is that when we control for the distribution of different household types, British Columbia and Ontario look a lot more similar. And their poverty rates actually go up relative to Quebec's. Alberta's also goes up, but to a lesser degree. And what that's suggesting is that Quebec is actually at a population disadvantage vis-a-vis these populations. If Quebec had the same population as Alberta, their poverty rate would actually probably be higher. And the reasons the compositional differences that are driving those differences is that Quebec has more single parent households, it has more unattached individuals, and it has actually fewer biparental households. When we also control for the labor market participation, what we actually see is quite a pronounced bifurcation of the poverty trajectories between the English-speaking provinces and Quebec. Now Alberta looks a lot more like British Columbia and Ontario, suggesting that the real differences between Alberta and the other provinces isn't so much in the generosity or their approach to social welfare as it is in the strength of their economy. And Quebec is really apart from the others with a difference of about 5% on average, but roughly, yeah, about 5%, 4 or 5%. So that's quite a substantial difference. Still, though, however, when we compare things internationally, we do see, you know, if we were to include the other provinces in this chart, it'd be a bit too much information on one graph, but you basically see the other provinces lying nearer to the standardized US poverty rate. It's interesting that when we control for population composition, the differences between Quebec and the other countries aren't quite as, we don't see as much change as we saw in the provincial standardization. And Quebec remains relatively in the same position as it was to the other countries internationally. So we see that the way that Quebec is dealing with unattached individuals is still keeping it away from its objective of being the least being counted among the countries with the least poor households. Go ahead, Axel. I'll let you wrap this up.
My turn. To my enormous surprise, we're exactly on time. So to conclude, I have a series of conclusions here, but the basic conclusion really is that it looks like Quebec, in some respects at least, has achieved or is achieving the kinds of quote-unquote social democratic goals of reducing poverty among families with families with children, and doing so in at least to some extent through activation rather than through passive transfer measures, has succeeded with the very substantial exception of lone singles living by themselves or childless couples, particularly those who are out of work. So it's the activation component that seems to be particularly important in the Quebec case, but clearly the family component also has been fairly successful. So it's a divided judgment to some extent. The goals of the Bill 112 are being met. At the same time, we should warn that in the more recent past, and we have some figures on that if you're interested in seeing those, there seems to be an uptick in some measures of poverty in Quebec, partly probably the result of some cutbacks that have taken place under the Couillard regime, although those have been relatively modest as far as we can tell. What other conclusions do we want to draw? This essentially, it's really the two parent families that have benefited the most from the Quebec regime, and that is no doubt partly or mostly because of the daycare system, the subsidized daycare system, and more generous parental leaves. Now we can go maybe to a final slide, which I wanted to briefly comment on the initial question that we had asked. Is Quebec drifting apart from the rest of Canada? There is a little bit of literature that actually connects a sense of national identity and the development of a welfare state, as some of you may be aware. And there certainly are some indications that the Quebec policy-making elite, or at least some members of that elite, I think Paul was sort of secretly one of them, saw the expansion of the Quebec welfare state as one way of accentuating Quebec's distinctive nature compared to the rest of Canada. So the question is Quebec succeeding in drifting away from the ROC from the rest of Canada? And at the moment, we have to be very, very cautious in making any predictions. Certainly, there is no sign of Quebec going back to the austerity movement that the other provinces have followed, particularly during the 1990s and the early 2000s. On the other hand, there are some signs that the other provinces are becoming interested in seeing whether or not they can introduce the kinds of reforms that Quebec has introduced in the 1990s, since the 1990s. We hear more and more about daycare, particularly in provinces where the NDP is currently in power. The federal government has become more active again in social policy, particularly with respect to families with children. So it's entirely possible that a convergence at a more, let us say, social democratic level may occur over the next 10 years. Bache, Doug Ford, in which case Quebec obviously will have simply been the Saskatchewan of the 2010s. I mean, this is not the first time that something like that would happen in the history of the Canadian welfare state. This is, after all, how healthcare emerged and how the pension system was implemented eventually in the 1960s. So those are our conclusions, very cautious ones, and I want to thank you all very much. Next slide. I want to thank you all very much for having listened to this, and we are open to your questions.
Well, thanks to you, Axel, and Isham and Charles for sharing your results with us. It was very interesting and lots of material to share in a brief period of time. I'd like to remind our participants that we invite you to write your question. You need to open your control panel and open the question tab to write them down. And actually, Sophie Mathieu has taken the lead, and I have a few questions from her. But so let's start right now. And Chuck, if you could go back to figure 1.5, please. You open this. Okay, so figure 1, she says it's a bit puzzling to her, and she's asking, did I see that spendings increase in Quebec in 2004? And then she goes on saying, was this not after the Liberals were elected? I'm also curious about figure 1.7, knowing that the Liberals have made major cuts in the CPE, the Service de Garde à la Petite Enfance, and promoted the use of private non-subsidized childcare. So I guess, could you comment further on these two figures?
I can answer some of it. First of all, you shouldn't forget that the strategy to combat poverty was unanimously adopted by the National Assembly. This was a cross-party consensus, and the Liberals were as committed as the PQ was to implementing the policy. So yes, the increase is the increase in expenditures, as you see in figure 1.5, begins in 2004 and really takes off in 2005, and that is because the Liberals were in effect committed to that same policy. They have been cutting back to some extent. At least they have increased the fees for the Quebec daycare centers, and yes, they have allowed more or stimulated more use of private daycare. But the fact of the matter remains that the daycare center in daycare system in Quebec is so much more widespread, allows so more women with small children to work than in any other provinces, that it alone has remained an extremely big force in helping to reduce poverty rates.
Yeah, I'd add to that. You know, one of the main themes in the poverty, like in the wider literature on poverty reduction strategies, Quebec was the first government to adopt one of these, or the first province to adopt one of these. But over the last 10 years, we've seen these adopted in every other province as well, or at least committed to. A couple of provinces have actually yet to deliver their plans. But a theme in that is that you know, the desire to reduce poverty. You know, these poverty reduction strategies are being implemented and proposed by parties of every political stripe. It seems to be a fairly nonpartisan issue. Different parties have different ideas about how to achieve it, you know, along the left-right spectrum. But for the most part, the objective of reducing poverty, and that relates to a wider consensus that I think that Helene Noel has written on in the past in the sort of global policy world, that poverty is an issue for moral reasons, but also for economic reasons. But what's interesting about Quebec, though, is because that process has been in place for so long, we've been able to see governments change a few times, but still see that continuation of the attempts or efforts to reduce poverty. The other thing that I would say to that is, you know, within Quebec, the Liberals are regarded as the right wing of the parties that are available, at least insofar as the CAQ hasn't been elected yet. But when you go outside of Quebec, you know, the Liberals of Quebec are actually probably relatively left-wing, especially if you were to compare them to, say, the Sask Party in Saskatchewan, or the formerly Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta, which actually, you know, points to a wider regime-level effect. That there's a different ordering of things in Quebec that transcends the political partisanship of whatever party's in power.
Maybe Chuck, that we can show slide 39 to show that there has been nowhere near as much of cutbacks as the rumors have suggested in Quebec.
Yes.
Yeah, there have been.
I want to add something about daycares.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go ahead.
The changes in daycare benefits, I think, affected more the middle class than the low-income families, because with the new change with the private daycares, but in terms of benefits, people with low income will get back their money even if they pay more in the private daycares. This is why, and we discussed about this last time, this is why I think that Quebec focus more on low-income families, and the changes we can see with daycares, and more recently with the fiscal budget, focusing focus on taxes on low incomes, show that we continue to help or that the policies affect more low incomes families. So the change for daycare I don't think that will affect the curve of the poverty, because the people with low income will not be affected at all.
Right. Sorry, Sam, did I interrupt you? I'm sorry. I just want to mention also, I seem to have a personal problem with my internet connection, so bear with me if I'm running out. I'll try to connect again. Hopefully I'll be able to make it through. So I have another question here from Nairn McKay, asking you to speculate on the role of having an anti-poverty act and how it may have helped played in the development of social policy in Quebec and its benefits. So, and then he goes on saying, what kind of background work was needed to bring about this broader commitment to poverty reduction? So how this commitment to adopt a strategy to combat poverty, what kind of background got Quebec into that?
Yeah, I understand the question, and it's a question that's often raised. What's so special about Quebec, really? I think I'm not a particularly a specialist in Quebec politics, but what most people point to is that Quebec has a peculiar kind of civil society compared to the rest of the Canadian provinces. It has a far stronger labor movement, which is far more well connected with the political elite. It has a whole or fauna of civil society movements that are extremely active and highly mobilized, anti-poverty movements, the feminist movement, and so on and so forth. And the strength of those movements has been shown a number of times, not only with the infamous tuition fee business a few years ago when the students erupted, but as far back as the 1980s when Robert Bourassa was actually trying to cut back in tandem with the other provinces and the federal government in order to control the public debt. He met with a storm of protest and it basically backed off in 1989, if I'm not mistaken. And when Lucien Bouchard came to power, he too felt in the mid-1990s, which was the heyday of austerity and cutbacks, he too felt compelled to propose a series of cutbacks, and again ran into an enormous amount of blowback from civil society, and finally organized the two famous summits with the unions and all other, a range of other organizations that have been active in protesting against austerity, and concluded a social summit agreement in which the government felt compelled more or less to commit itself to the fight against poverty and to daycare and various other things in exchange for those organizations accepting certain kinds of cutbacks and tightening of the belt. And so Quebec has a really quite different political history in that respect, and that certainly comes some way towards explaining the difference. The other element in it may well be nationalism itself. So there are some indications that some part of the Quebec political elite views this as one way of what we in the book I think somewhere call creating a distinctive society by stealth. In other words, the idea that through having a very different welfare state from the rest of Canada, you can accentuate the distinctness of Quebec society as well. So there are a number of factors that would account for that.
I could probably speak a little bit sort of bigger picture. I think Axel answered the question one way. The other, when I was hearing the question, I was thinking that they were also talking about just more generally about what the impact of this type of policy event or policy intervention of an act or a poverty reduction strategy could have on poverty levels. As I mentioned before, poverty reduction strategies have been implemented in the other provinces. Particularly, that conversation in the rest of Canada has been steered by what happened in Quebec first, and then also around the same time, not long afterwards, in Newfoundland and Labrador, and what we've seen in terms of the poverty levels in those provinces having gone down afterward. One of the questions that I've looked at recently is the timing of those events, like the introduction of these plans and acts, and how they relate to poverty, actually relate to overall levels. And one of the things that's been sort of interesting is, so this graph here is showing the longer term trend in the poverty level since 2000. Quebec implemented its first poverty reduction strategy in 2004, right? The act was put through in 2002. And what's clear is that a lot of the gains in poverty that have been achieved in Quebec were actually achieved leading up to the introduction of these their formalization as in terms of documents. And so one of the research questions going forward, I've actually found that this is also the case in some of the other provinces, with the exception of Ontario, that these acts the legislation and strategies tend to follow reductions in poverty rather than lead them. One of the interesting questions is we looking at the longer term trend in poverty, we see that it looks as though poverty levels have settled at a lower level in Quebec. It would be interesting to think about how, or to explore maybe 10 years from now, to what extent that leveling off of poverty at a new historical low has had to do with the institutionalization and formalization through the act and poverty reduction strategies. And whether that's also going to be the case in other provinces.
Yes, for me, for example, I'm very curious to see if we in the future research, if we examine the situation with the higher threshold to see how those strategies can affect middle class families or lower middle class families in Quebec, maybe we can come out with another story. Knowing for me now, and from the literature and from the recent budget, I still convinced that Quebec continue to focus on lower income families, but maybe we should see for lower middle class how those strategies can affect this group of population.
Thank you. I'm having some issue with my internet connection, so I want to ask you, Chuck, can you see the question on your screen?
I'm looking. No, unfortunately not.
Okay, so
I see them now. Yeah, I see them now, and I recognize a number of names. Hi, Gerarda. Hi, David.
So hopefully I won't break, but if I do, please read the question. I will try to reconnect anyway. So let's go on. Sorry about that. Have a question from Geranda Nutten. She's asking, using provincial limbs makes sense in context of policy goals of the Quebec government. I'm wondering, however, why you haven't considered looking at effects using an anchored limb. There may have been absolute improvements in poverty indicators. A real improvement in purchasing power is a good thing too, but it's less ambition than the Quebec government goals.
I can speak briefly to that. Oh, sorry, is there a screen on at the moment? Here, let's bring it back to this. Sorry, my screen keeps jumping back to my inbox. I'm sure, I think I've actually got an unanswered email there from Geranda, so sorry, from a couple of years ago. But the anchored limb question, we haven't gone there. I'm aware of the question. I mean, I have a wider philosophical opinion about that. I think for this project, we had to draw boundaries somewhere. I think more broadly, have a longer conversation, Geranda, on maybe another time about whether or not, like, how useful anchored limbs are. I think it really, I think it speaks to an empirical question that hasn't really been investigated that well, which is how much do people's, bearing for things like relative deprivation and consumption standards change from year to year. Anchoring the limbs suggests that they don't change from year to year. Although we do know that they do change over longer periods of time. So should we anchor them to 5 years or 3 years or 10 years or 20 years? And then, yeah, it ends up being such a bigger conversation that I can't possibly provide an adequate answer at this time, but that's sort of where my thought process is going on it.
There's a pragmatic part of an answer too, of course, and that is that it's much harder to compare with the other countries. The limb is by far the simplest way of comparing with other countries. And since part of what we wanted to investigate was whether Quebec was actually succeeding in reaching its goal of essentially getting close to the Scandinavian countries in terms of outcomes, we were kind of forced to use the limb primarily. It's not a fantastic answer, but it's as good an answer as we can think of.
Yes, but it is what the experts of international database suggest also to do, because if we use absolute poverty, for example, maybe we can have another story. But the experts of LIS, for example, suggest strongly to use this indicator to measure poverty.
Thank you. So I have a question from Mathieu Lizotte. He says, sorry, I came in late into the presentation, so maybe you answered his question, but he's asking, could you please discuss the decomposition method you used?
Yeah, I mean, it's poverty standardization. It's a poverty rate standardization. Basically, it's a Oaxaca blinder decomposition. We regressed the poverty outcomes on the explanatory variables, which were our household types and our different levels of labor market attachment and the interaction between them. And then we used that model. Actually, sorry, maybe what you're trying to get is whether we did a 2 versus 3 group. We actually did the 2 groups, so we estimated average effects. Well, actually, that doesn't actually make a difference. Sorry. Basically, we did the regression. We got the coefficients for the different provinces and the different prevalences for the different provinces. And we ran the model again. Basically, we resimulated the rates based on those coefficients for each province. But if we change the explanatory or the prevalence variables, so if we change the composition and we punch that into, you punch basically Quebec's values on the variables into the regression model for one of the other jurisdictions, then that would give us a different result, right? But we're holding the coefficients, we're estimating the coefficients separately for each province, and we're only changing the composition effects. That was, I wasn't prepared to spit that out in 3 sentences, but I think I got most of the relevant information about how we did it. And of course, there's more details in the book.
Mm-hmm. All right, should I go on with the next question?
Yeah.
All right, so that's this one from Colin Busby. Is asking, given the similarities of all provinces on poverty measures for single person households, and given this group is dragging average poverty rates up in Quebec and elsewhere, how large is this group of household? And what do European comparators, European countries do to better alleviate poverty for this group?
The size of the group,
I could probably speak to
off
the
the
first
top
part.
of my head. I can't remember how big that group is.
I could probably speak to the first part of that question, Axel. Maybe you could talk to more about what's going on in Europe with these groups.
Yeah.
So just really quickly to the first part, single parent families are actually a really small part of the poverty story. They're a highly visible but small part. And I mentioned a paper by David Brady earlier. He's an American researcher and he focuses on the US, but he has a pretty good paper that came out last year that explains this. We disproportionately focus on single parent families. And actually, one of the really interesting things about this project was I mentioned earlier that when you look at families and unattached individuals, there's a residual category that you end up with when you do these types of decompositions and stuff. And these are the other household types. And it's quite, it used to be a smaller category back in the 70s and 80s, but over time it's become an increasingly large category. And more work could be done going forward to explore that other category, these sorts of new types of housing arrangements that are emerging, particularly because I think some of them might be as large as the single parent family group by this time. So yeah, so the first answer to your question, the first point that I would say is that they're a relatively small proportion of the story, even though they're a highly visible part of the story. Mm-hmm. And even the differences between the provinces aren't major differences, although there's a few more of those families in Quebec.
But it is the case, is it not, Chuck, that the proportion of single individuals living by themselves is higher in Quebec than the other provinces,
A little bit.
And it is definitely, I remember we had this whole issue about Denmark, is definitely much higher in the Scandinavian countries than it is elsewhere.
Mm.
And nevertheless,
was the question about single unattached or single parent?
yes, it was both, I think.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
The single person household.
Sorry, you cut out, Sarah. What was that?
Single person household.
Oh,
Yeah,
single person household. Sorry, I was rambling on about single parents. Yeah.
No. So single person households, I think Quebec has a higher proportion than the other provinces, which is why we get those results with the standardization, which show that if the other provinces had had the same composition of families as Quebec, they would have had even higher poverty rates than they have now. But we also know from the literature that the Scandinavian countries have very high levels, relatively speaking. I can't remember what the exact numbers are, but relatively speaking, very high numbers of single individuals living by themselves. And the poverty rates for those individuals are much, much lower than they are here. And what they do is two things. They do basically what Quebec does for families, they do for single individuals as well. So they invest an enormous amount in activation, in getting people training and keeping them attached to the labor market and so on. And of course, their transfers are more generous. And in the rest of Europe, the numbers are smaller. Their poverty rates are nevertheless lower than, as you can see here now on this slide, nevertheless lower, much lower than they are here. And that's essentially an effect of relatively generous transfer payments. With all the negative effects attached to it, right? You have the big problem in France and in Spain especially, about a large proportion of singles basically being cut out of the labor market altogether.
The focus of the book really became the families because that was sort of the focus of Quebec. But this whole area of like unattached individuals, this is one of the most at-risk poverty groups in Canada these days. I think that's becoming increasingly known among researchers and advocates, but it's really an invisible poverty and an underappreciated and underexplored area. And I don't even know national comparison.
It's also a complex group to examine, because we can have many profiles in this group, and according to the literature, we can find, for example, people with mental health, with problem in terms of long time unemployment, etc. So it's difficult to define a specific group that needs specific policy when we talk about in attached not working population.
Does that include a retired individual, a 65?
No.
This one drops out. That's not including retired. This in our analysis. Yeah, that was a separate group.
Okay, so I think that
the retired actually do much better in Canada than they do in many of the other countries.
Yes, and even better than the other household types in Canada.
Yeah, it's the success story of the Canadian welfare state. It's not widely known. A single real success story.
Yeah, right.
If I'm right, Chuck, the unattached not working people are less than 50 years old, no?
65, less than 65, yeah.
Yes. So they are not among retired age.
Okay, thank you. So I have 2 other questions. It's almost 3:15, so I think I will read them quickly, and unless someone have an urgent question. Oh, Geranda sent another one. So I don't know, you gentlemen, do you have a few more minutes to share with us?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
No problem. Okay.
All right. Sophie is asking, what would you respond to someone saying that free labor markets could be the answer to poverty, considering table 4.1? And I guess that's about poverty rates in Alberta for both 2 parents and single parent families. And I guess, yeah, she's comparing, suspect, of course, the poverty rate, if we do nothing in Quebec and if we do nothing in Alberta, poverty rates are higher in Quebec. And maybe that's what she's aiming at, is that we are a poor society, I guess.
Here's a simple answer. Free labor markets are wonderful when you also have tight labor markets. they're a lot less wonderful when labor markets are not tight. In other words, during a boom, you don't need welfare policy.
Mm-hmm.
If labor markets are, except for people who are incapacitated in some way. But if you do not have an oil boom, then free labor markets will not solve your problem.
Yeah, and I think Sophie's hit it.
Even for single parents, families, free labor markets. If you have a child with under 2 years old, it's difficult to fully integrate the labor markets without public services in terms of daycare, etc. It's like, yes, good, it's good thing, but some kinds of family need some services to be able to integrate the labor markets.
I think Sophie's really hitting on, her question is really hitting on what I thought was one of the really interesting next questions or sort of peripheral results in this analysis, which is the pattern of low poverty in Alberta, at least during that period, and how it was a little bit different from the other provinces. But then, of course, when we standardize for that difference, the Alberta regime actually looks a lot like the other ones, right? Which really suggests that the labor market story is something, and in order to explore that more, we need to look at more iterations of longitudinal data and look at how those patterns change. You know, 2002 to 2007 were pretty good years for Alberta. So what does that look like when you don't have that economy? And I like to think of BC as the Alberta. This is what Alberta would look like if it didn't have a strong economy. So BC is like Alberta with a lousier economy.
All right, so thank you. Actually, the question by Geranda was actually a comment following up on your discussion about anchored limb. So I will, she's just saying no need to discuss live. So I will forward it to you, Chuck, and all of you, so you can exchange beyond this webinar.
For sure, I look forward to it.
Excellent. So I guess this gets us to the end of the webinar. Again, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting, and thank you for your question, all of you who were listening in. Thank you for being with us. I'd just like to mention that our next webinar will be on July 12th, if I remember well, not 13th, 12th. And we will be discussing Census 2016. As you know, the files are now available in the RDC. So what's new in this new cycle, and how do we deal with the comparability issue compared to the National Household Survey and so on. So I invite you to be there. And also, if you have not yet sent your proposal to be there in Hamilton in October, please do so. I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully, in Hamilton on October 18 and 19. So again, thank you all.
Thank you all for having listened.
My pleasure.
Merci beaucoup, Sarah, puis merci de nous avoir donné cette occasion de présenter notre livre. Et puis merci, Axel. Thank you, Charles, and see you next time.
Yeah. Avec grand plaisir. À bientôt.
À bientôt.
Bye bye.
Are we still connected? Are we still connected? The three of us?
I think you are, Axel. I don't know.
I think so. I think so.
You're all just listening to us now.
Oh, that was pretty good.
Yeah, no? It went very well. So it's a lot of material to present, yeah, and it's complex. It's not easy to summarize it. So you did a good job.
Yeah.
How many did we end up having? Just the 10? Or how many attendees? How many attendees did we have?
I went up to 9.
20, I think 25.
Yeah, but that includes us. So.
Okay, that's pretty good.
Well, that's pretty good.
We got questions from about 4 or 5 people. That's like a 20% engagement.
What is 15% of 20 times $39?
I'm sure all those. I'm sure those.
Actually, I was going to say that we had 28 registrations. So because of these events, you know, these webinars are free. They are during work days. So it's always the case that in the last minute there's something come up and they cannot connect. But they usually ask for the PowerPoints or go for listen to the videos. And
Yeah, is the video immediately available on the internet now?
no, I have to do some editing.
Okay.
You know, I cut the introduction where I speak because it's not really relevant, and so I focus really on the presentation. And
Okay.
yeah.
So you'll send us a link as soon as it's done?
Yeah, I can do that. Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. I would appreciate that. I have several friends who wanted to watch it or hear it and couldn't make it.
Excellent. So will you be there in Hamilton?
I'm not trying to be there.
Sure yet. I'm not sure yet.
Not sure yet.
I've
probably.
taken a virage of my own
Oh,
into,
yeah.
into social theory.
Okay.
So I'm very busy with that, but we'll see.
All right.
I'll probably be there, Sarah.
That's good. And Michelle, possibly?
I don't know. I will see and let you know.
All right. You have until July and the deadline.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for organizing this. It was a wonderful job.
That's the easy part.
Thank you very much.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine. Bye-bye.
Bye. So now we're really being cut out, I assume.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Salut.